Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com. I'm running a contest on WeissAdvice.com. I frequently do run contests, and this month is no exception. This contest is going to be a stock plugin contest where any member of Weiss Advice can mix any of the trackouts that have been provided up to date and do a mix using only stock plugins. Of course, they will have to show their work and show that there were no third-party plugins used at any point, but you select your favorite DAW and use whatever is provided for free with that DAW. The point of this exercise is to get you to think outside of the box in terms of whatever limitations you might believe that you have. Now, I'm going to play one of the records where I've done a mix using only stock plugins, and when I say only stock plugins, by the way, I'm actually talking about the OG Digi Design stock plugins, not even like the Air plugins that are provided with later versions of Pro Tools here. But if we look at these channels here, you'll notice that everything is very simple. I've got deverbs, the stock compressor, stock EQ, nothing crazy like that. I'm going to play down some of this mix, and maybe you tell me if you think it sounds like it was done with only stock plugins.
Never find me. But if they happen to know your name, write down every word they say. Use good posture and provide. Shake up the wrist, need eye to eye.
So I originally did this record back in, I want to say it was the end of 2011, so a little more than 10 years ago. I redid the mix now very recently. I guess this is I really finished it actually maybe about 2 days ago, but I worked on it mostly about 2 weeks ago. And I spent about half the time mixing. I only used stock plugins, and I'd say it's pretty fair assessment that I destroyed my mix from 10 years ago. Not even comparable. One sounds like a demo in comparison. And the reasoning for this is pretty obvious. I'm better at engineering 10 years later than I was back then. So the point of this exercise is to say, if we apply ourselves, our listening skills, our techniques, that we can actually vastly supersede what having great third-party equipment, plugins, outboard equipment, whatever, that really the bulk of the end result comes down to our capabilities and not the gear that we're using. And I know that we say that all the time, and then we see tons of examples where people are using expensive gear, but this is an example where I'm not. Now, I do want to stress that we do have to be creative. We do have to think outside the box when it comes to certain techniques. Now, all of the stuff that we're hearing, by the way, is also recorded very inexpensively. It was recorded in the band's living room using mostly inexpensive microphones and a channel strip. So this is a very low budget production that we're getting to hear. So I'm using some techniques to compensate for the fact that some of the captures are not that rich. This is actually a technique that I kind of showed before in another video where I was using FabFilter Saturn to put some body into a sound that just didn't have real substance there to begin with. Here we're getting a little bit more of that. We've got this happening in two different instances. I've got parallel returns on the vocals, and that's here, that are doing a similar idea, and I'm going to detail. And then we also have parallel returns on the electric guitars that are using a similar technique but with a slightly different intention. So I'm going to start with the vocals just to kind of outline what's going on. I'm going to solo these vocals here so we can hear them all by themselves. So this is basically the processed version.
But if they happen to know your name, write down every word they say. Use good posture and...
Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out all of the parallel processing that I'm using. And I'm going to play it again.
But if they happen to know your name, write down every word they say.
So what we'll notice is that not only has the sound become smaller, but it also has become narrower in terms of its frequency content. It's duller, it doesn't have quite the same richness of the low end, and it's not simply a loss of level. It's actually a loss of frequency content. I'm going to bring back in my parallel distortions, which is what this low, mid, and high are here first, just so we can hear that.
But if they happen to know your name, write down every word they say.
And what we get as a net result is something that generally just sounds like a better initial capture. It's as if the microphone chosen was a slightly better microphone in terms of overall quality. Now, don't get me wrong, it probably would have been better to have picked a better microphone and to have those resources available, but we're kind of getting a close facsimile as to what that would have sounded like using this technique. Now, I'm also going to throw in my parallel compression return, and that's going to make the whole picture complete.
But if they happen to know your name.
Okay, so what's going on these channels? Well, let's take a look here. I have an EQ, which is effectively acting as crossovers. I'm separating the vocal in parallel channels into different frequency segments. So here, this first one, the low vocal, is everything that's under 323 hertz. I set it based on where it sounded like I needed to target, by the way. I didn't do even crossovers. That's a different technique. My mid channel here has two, a high pass and a low pass here. One is high passing at 450 hertz, and the other one is low passing at 1.5K. So it's focusing on the area between 450 and 1.5. That's my mid-range. And then here, in my high end, it's really only just capturing the very brightest tonality. It's the stuff that's above 7K. So I'm not affecting everything in the frequency realms. I'm leaving a lot of the mid-range open and clean. I'm really just trying to target the things that I felt needed a little bit of juice. They needed a little bit of excitement here. After that, I'm using distortion. And I'm not using a lot of distortion. So here on the high band, I'm only using the distortion at 0.3. It doesn't break up. It just sounds like it's been shifted a little bit harmonically. There's a color to it. It's pretty subtle. Mid band, same thing. And then low band, even less. Right? So it's very, very subtle across the board, and in the high band, specifically, I'm incorporating a little bit of compression as well, because this was exciting the sibilances a little bit too much. So just whenever the high end gets a little bit too much on this high band that I've created, I have a compressor that's keeping it in check. This is effectively, by the way, how most exciters work. So if you've ever used anything like the Aphex Aural exciter or any kind of other exciter plug like the Ozone exciter, this is kind of what it's doing. It's just applying a little bit of distortion to a frequency band. And so what I'm doing is I'm doing subtle amounts of excitement across most of the frequencies that are contained within this vocal. This can be a really, really effective technique when something just feels like it needs to wake up a little bit because the energy of the initial capture wasn't so good. Then lastly, I am using a parallel compression return here. This is my aux 4, which has been very, very carefully labeled, as you can see.
But if they happen to know your name.
And it's a really, really cruddy 1176 emulation. But the cruddiness of it actually kind of works in our favor here because it gives it a little bit of that, like, lo-fi grain. Like, it makes it feel a little punk rockish to me, and that actually works in the context of this song really well. So I'm using a very fast attack and a very fast release. Not quite all the way as fast as they can go, but pretty darn close. And then I've actually got a limiter stapled onto the back end. And what this is doing is it's just creating a streamlined body of sound that helps to lock the vocal in place when it's being surrounded by a lot of heavy guitars.
But if they happen to know your name, write down every word.
So it's just one streamlined dynamic of vocal. And that makes up the vocal sound.
But if they happen to know your name, write down every word they say.
Now, let's talk about the electric guitars here. One of the electric guitars is a lo-fi distorted guitar, and it sounds like this. Right, it's really lo-fi-ish, but the other guitars are actually kind of on the clean side. And to me, while I really like the tone of the guitar itself, I felt like the part, especially in the chorus, really needed a little bit more texture. It felt like it wanted to have more of that punk rock energy. So I'm doing the same kind of parallel distortion techniques, but I'm doing them for the purpose of adding texture to the sound. So if I grab my parallel channels here, I have this one on the right guitar, and I'm going to just turn this up for a moment. And you can hear that it's almost feeling like it's coming off of like an old gramophone being played through like a bad wired radio. What I have going on is I have a filter that's going up to about 4K, maybe 2.5K. Well, it's cutting out everything except for some of the upper mids and treble. And then I have the distortion on again, but this time I'm using some saturation as well, which is a little bit more aggressive on this plugin. And I'm using the distortion, but you'll notice instead of being at like 0.3 like on the vocals, I'm at 2.6. So I'm just being a lot more indulgent because I'm trying to get the texture of the distortion and blend that up underneath. I have the same thing going on this left guitar, so here's the clean. And to me, that was just way too clean. Like, there's no noise or crunch or grunge or anything in there. So on the parallel return here, I have the same idea going, where I'm creating an EQ'd version, but I'm not filtering anything. Instead, I'm just really laying into the distortion. And here you can see I've got the distortion turned pretty much all the way up, as well as a good amount of saturation. And then on the back end of that, I even have this rectify plugin, which creates an even more aggressive distortion. So it just sounds really, really strong and harsh. It sounds like a fuzz pedal kind of overdrive, and that's what I'm going for, but notice that I have it tucked down like almost 20 dB below where the original signal is, and so it just ends up adding kind of a filmy, grainy, crunchy, fun little texture. So I'll play it without and then with. And I ended up going the less is more route, so you really just hear it as a texture. But if I wanted to make it a little bit more in your face, I could turn it up some. Maybe even EQ it to make it feel like it blends in. Like, I could certainly take it further, but I felt like just a little bit of the texture was enough to get what I was really trying to go for, which was adding a little bit of that rock and roll energy into what's otherwise, in my opinion, maybe a little bit too clean. So take these techniques, make them your own, play around with them, find ways to do them uniquely, and let's wrap this video up. If you like what we're doing here, hit that like button. If you want to check more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification, and if you find it within your hearts and souls to share this with other folks, it would certainly help out the channel, and I would appreciate it. Lastly, if you have God, I am the worst at these endings. This is the theme, the real theme of the channel, is how bad I am at ending these videos. I do want to hear from you in the comments section below. I look forward to it. And lastly, you know what we say. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.